G'day everyone, my name is Daniel Patterson. I'm a forensic toxicologist in New South Wales and I appear in state and federal court matters including the family courts. I'm a full member of 2 toxicology bodies and a forensic science society. So something that we regularly see in court is that legal practitioners and even judicial officers, like judges, might not actually be familiar with the sort of testing that's in front of them, and that can lead them to make some pretty erroneous decisions or give weight to evidence they perhaps should not give weight to. So what we're going to go through today is the type of tests that are available from least accurate to most accurate, what they all are, why they should be avoided, that sort of thing. So let's start with the least accurate test, in my opinion. That's going to be something called ELISA. That stands for Enzyme-Linked Immunosorbent Assay. There is no credible drug testing agency in Australia that I have found that still uses it. I can't even find dodgy drug testing agencies that do them. But there are plenty of non-accredited ones in places like India and the United States that will do it. So, very simply, I don't even have an ELISA well because we don't use it in Australia, so this is going to be the best demonstrative I can do. Let's say this is my little ELISA well. They're usually tiny little things like that. Now, it's this colour, and I introduce some saliva or blood or something like that. And then it stays the same, that's a negative. Or if it changes to something like that colour, okay, that's a positive. We've found whatever we're looking for. The problem is, this test is notoriously unreliable. I think it's about a 40% accuracy. I'll quote the actual study and statistic up there, but it's not that reliable. That's why it's not used anymore. It is still used, bizarrely, in hair testing by American companies. It means that any negative result you have from hair from any ELISA should be taken with a grain of salt, because I have quite literally seen people that take ADHD medication every day, so their hair would be riddled with amphetamine, and they still pass the ELISA. So yes, it's not a reliable test. Now, for whatever reason, because family court especially is so rinse and repeat, they just go and copy and paste template orders off the internet, and then they end up using the same tests over and over again, even though they're not really scientifically accurate. Now, next up, we have immunoassay, specifically lateral flow immunoassay, or what you might call a site test, an on-site test, instant test, whatever terminology you want to use. So what we'll start with is oral fluid or saliva testing. Now, this is devices like this, commonly in Australia, that are used by police. So this is just the drug wipe, made by SecureTech. Now, depending on what state you're in, it's going to be anything from the drug wipe 2 through to the drug wipe 6. In New South Wales, they use the drug wipe 3, which is manufactured for police only, and commercially you can get the drug wipe 6, which is basically the 3 with 3 extra panels. So, how these work is quite simple. There's a lot of engineering that goes into the test itself that we don't need to worry about, but the police officer gives you that part, you drag it along your tongue, you only need about 0.2 ml of saliva, because when they reattach it to the test, so it goes just right back there, clicks in, then they press there, which is a glass ample that is filled with basically a buffer solution, and then they just lay it flat. That's the lateral flow aspect. You don't tilt it, you don't need to do anything, you just lay it flat and let it run. Now, how it works is you effectively are just looking for what is there. There's reagents in these little pads. Now you can see the red lines up the top. That just shows the test is working. If drugs were detected, other red lines would appear. And that would show us that, yes, there potentially is that drug or drug metabolite present in the person's saliva. So that's it. Running these in the field is really easy. All you need is good vision to know whether someone's using drugs or not. Now, I have only ever seen a need to do saliva testing for court once in the past 4 or 5 years. But what will commonly happen, in family law especially, is that the parties might agree to something like before the father or the mother attends to pick up the child, they must come to us and do a saliva drug test. That proves they have not used any drugs today. So saliva, you're looking at a relatively short window. Depending on the drug, it could be as little as 2 or 3 hours for something like benzodiazepines, to as much as maybe 24 to 48 hours for things like methamphetamine. And cannabis in therapeutic doses is about 7 hours. So we're not looking at an ultra-long detection window on saliva drug tests. But say someone does fail this saliva drug test, what does that mean? Well, we don't trust this. These are pretty accurate, and in Australia, for a device to be compliant with Australian standards, it has to have at least a 90% accuracy. However, there is still that 10% room for error. So what happens next, if a device like that returns a not negative, is you grab some sort of oral fluid preservation, a buffer fluid, and it has to be approved under Australian standards as well. And basically you put the saliva into the buffer, it keeps it intact until it gets to the lab for testing. That's when the lab will do liquid chromatography mass spectrometry, which we will talk about later. So then, okay, we're done with oral fluid. Now, let's move on to urine. This one is very common to see in family court orders, and in fact, used to be the default until about 2021, when the courts changed over to hair testing. So, urine testing once again. Really simple instant screening test. In this case though, the lines are good. The lines mean that that drug or drug analyte was not detected. No lines is bad, so in this case we can see that methamphetamine and cannabis have been used, so MET and THC. There's no lines on them. So yes. Now with this one, we don't need to worry about preserving it. Urine is actually stable at room temperature for about 4 days before we start seeing degradation. So you just suck it up into a vacutainer like this using a specialized vacutainer kit. And yeah, you just transport it to the lab. As long as it gets there within 4 days, you're all good. Once again, this is really not proof of anything. I'm much more skeptical about urine tests because there's so much that can interfere with them and so many different issues that can come up with a urine test. So we need to actually make sure samples are going to the lab because the lab is evidence. This, you might as well just call this someone's opinion. It's not really great evidence. I'd shoot it down instantly and say that no, it doesn't comply with Australian standards to do the test and not do a lab confirmation. Now, if samples screen negative, we don't bother with the lab. But if they screen not negative, we send everything to the lab. Now then, we've got hair tests. Now, once again, we're talking about mass spectrometry. So let's talk about mass spectrometry. Mass spectrometry is so close to 100%, it's basically a rounding error. It is the most accurate form of testing we currently have. So something like ELISA that can be wrong half the time is dwarfed by something like mass spectrometry, which is so rarely wrong. And that's because with mass spectrometry, either something's there or it isn't. So here's what we sort of see. This would be an example of methamphetamine not being present in mass spectrometry, whereas here would be, say, an example of THC, cannabis, being present in mass spectrometry. So on the left is what we call a drug standard. That's basically the drug itself, and that's what we're looking for. On the right is the person's actual saliva. But we can do this with saliva, with hair, with urine, basically almost with anything. And then we can accurately tell not only is the drug there, but how much of it is present. And then we can dive deeper, we can look for more metabolites of it. So for instance, cocaine is not really cocaine in your system. We might find cocaine, but what we will also find is benzoylecgonine, agonine methylester, norcocaine, cocoethylene, that sort of thing. That tells us that yes, we have definitely found cocaine. I'll do a whole separate video on analytes and what we're looking at and what you're seeing in those reports. So here's the thing. I want all family lawyers and family law participants and judges to actually look at the results that you're getting in cases. Do they say that they are using ELISA? If they do, stop using that. All you are doing is basically guaranteeing that people who might be high as a kite on drugs are passing a drug test. You are not actually establishing anything regarding the safety of the child. And if it's a drug driving appeal, yeah, they could have been high as a kite on meth and they'd still come up negative. So you need to look at the quality of the evidence, and for me, ELISA is just not there. If anyone presents me an ELISA test, I'll just throw it out. It's not worth looking at. What I want to see is mass spectrometry. Because ELISA, like we said, it's just basically doing that side-by-side comparison. There could be a delayed reaction, there could be something wrong with the fluid, that sort of thing. It doesn't actually tell us anything. What we look at with mass spectrometry is what is there and how much of it is there. Any testing for court, if it's through hair testing, I would say needs to comply with Society of Hair Testing Practices. And if it's for urine or oral fluid, I would say needs to comply with Australian standards. But in any case, those are the tests available for you. So let's go through from worst to best. We've got ELISA, do not use it, absolute garbage. We've got immunoassay, that's good, but there is still a little bit of room for error. Then we've got LCMS, and that's the gold standard. Everything should be LCMS. Alright, take care.